God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things that I can, and wisdom to know the difference. If you have ever been to Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, you should know this prayer. It's one of the foundations of the AA spirituality. And I think it will help us to understand the wisdom with which Jesus survived and was victorious in the face of temptations. We can ask ourselves, why didn't Jesus turn stones to bread? Because eventually, you remember, he multiplied bread out of thin air. And there were people hungry, listening to him. He did use his divine powers to create more bread. Remember the story? So what stops him from creating bread now? If he can do it later, why not at this point? What stops him from genuflecting and humbling himself to the tempter, if later he will be humbled facing the Pilate, his prosecutor, about to sentence him to death? Why he could be humbled and bowing down to those in authority then, but not now? Why is it that at times later in his life, Jesus will do all these things that today in the desert he is tempted to do, but now he is refusing, and later he is doing them just like that, without any problems? Maybe it is, like this prayer says, knowing what things can be changed and what cannot. Maybe it is about something else yet. So this serenity prayer was composed originally by a Protestant pastor, Reinhard Niebuhr. He came from Germany to America in the 1930s and became famous Protestant theologian here. He composed this prayer in 1934, but didn't say it out loud until later in the 1940s, when our country was engaged in a terrible war with Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. Two of his friends came from Germany as well, another two great German theologians. One was Paul Tillich, and another Dietrich Bonhoeffer. These three great Protestant theologians, writers, preachers, they all came from Germany in the 1930s, escaping a very changing political climate in the Nazi Germany. And when Reinhard Niebuhr was reflecting on that prayer, he was looking at two of his friends, Paul Tillich and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, approaching the tragedy of Nazism in their homeland in a very different way. So Paul Tillich accepted the position at Union Theological Seminary in New York and tried to preach the message of peace and resistance against the Nazi philosophy and theology from afar. He believed that the situation on the ground cannot be changed by priests, preachers, or theologians. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, with whom you might be more familiar, began the same way. He also came to New York to teach at the university, but after a short time he believed that he cannot in good conscience stay safely here and allow the situation in Nazi Germany to deteriorate further. So after a while he returned back to Germany, actually on the very last ship from US to Germany, and was very personally involved in the resistance movement. As you know, many, if not most, German churches, Catholic and Protestant alike, were compromised. They went ahead with what the regime was telling them to do. But Bonhoeffer, unlike Paul Tillich, believed that this is something he can change, that his involvement in the process can make a difference. So he became an organizer in the underground church, in the Christian resistance movement. The final goal of the movement was either to assassinate Hitler or remove him from position by any means necessary. Unfortunately, the plot was discovered, and tragically, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was killed just days before the war ended. He was hanged. So in the late 40s, when Reinhard Niebuhr, for the first time in Heath, Massachusetts, delivers this sermon, he is looking at two of his friends who approached the problem of Nazism in two different ways. Paul Tillich, who believes that he has to accept the reality for what it is, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who believes that this is something he cannot accept and has to be personally involved in the process of changing. At the time of his temptations, Jesus accepted the fact that the stone is not the bread. He accepted the fact that at this point it makes no sense to become a miracle worker, even though later he will, very much so. He accepted that some things cannot be changed or altered during this time at the desert. But later, when he encountered the poor and the hungry and the injustice all around him, he became very personally involved in changing the things that could and should be changed. And I think our Christian wisdom consists just in that. To know when to accept the things the way they are, and realize when acceptance is not a choice. And usually it starts when we reflect on our role in relationship to others. It is not all right to accept injustice when it happens to other people. If you want to be a martyr yourself, you have that right, and it is a beautiful vocation to sacrifice your well-being, your time, your health, your wealth for others. But when you are facing the situation when you have to accept injustice done to someone else, you cannot stand on the sidelines and let things go. I think the biggest temptations that we face as Christians today is to recognize what can and should be tolerated, and when we should stand up and say never again. It stops now. And your discernment and your wisdom will bring you to different conclusions. Just like Paul Tillich and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, great theologians, great pastors, came to two different conclusions. But you have to ask yourself the question, what is my role at this place, at this time? God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things that I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Amen.